Having conquered almost every region in Gaul, Julius Caesar set his eyes on his new target, Britain. He had good reasons to attack the Britons. Some Brittonic tribes had supported the tribes of Gaul against Caesar. Moreover, Caesar knew that waging more wars was a good way to stay above the law. He wished to expand the scope of his conquests to bolster his authority and popularity. The talk of resources and trade routes which ran through the island probably fueled his ambition even further. The Britons, though a bit isolated, were not unknown by the people of the continent. Caesar wrote about them in his journals. He wrote about how it is thought they are descendants of the tribes who had traveled to the island from the European mainland and stayed there after starting to cultivate the land. He also mentioned Kent as the most civilized of all regions on the island. Caesar did not have many good things to say about the rest of the Briton tribes. He mentioned how they shared their wives and drew attention to the unnerving rituals of the Druids. Druids were priests who acted as religious and cultural leaders of their tribes and oversaw extreme rituals, including the occasional human sacrifice. Britons were actually part of the same culture as the tribes of Gaul. Some Brittonic tribes, especially those from the south, maintained a strong interaction with their cousins from the mainland. Caesar's intention was probably not to conquer the whole island with a single campaign. Most likely, with his first campaign, he wanted to gain a foothold on the island which he could use in the future to empower his conquest. Caesar wanted to gather all the information he could before he launched his attack. He wanted to get information from the merchants who had been trading with the inhabitants of the island. They did not give Caesar the information he wanted. They claimed that they did not have anything that would be of any use for Caesar. War was bad for business, and they probably did not want to provide Caesar with any information that would help him and encourage him further to carry out his campaign towards the island. Caesar turned to a Roman tribune to gather information about the island and its inhabitants. By this point, some Celtic tribes had been warned about the impending invasion. Caesar was a man feared by his enemies, and they did not want to invoke his wrath. They sent envoys to Caesar, hoping to secure their lives by promising submission. Caesar sent them back, most likely hoping to use their cooperative attitude to bolster his end in campaigns following the initial landing and invasion. Caesar's forces set out late at night. They first sailed to Dover for the legionaries to disembark. Yet, seeing how the cliffs of Dover would give his enemies the upper hand and expose his men to missile fire, he moved several miles further northeast, hoping to find a better position to land. The Britons had not stayed idly as Caesar's legions moved. They had been keeping track of their movements and were ready to meet them when they disembarked. The disembarkment was nightmarish for the Romans. Their ships could not approach the shores enough to allow them to land on shallow waters. Their enemies had already taken their positions on the beach and were hurling missiles towards the legionaries. The legionaries were outnumbered by almost 10 to 1, according to some sources. Nonetheless, Roman legions were known for their ability to survive under such overwhelming conditions. With supporting missile fire from their ships, they were able to break the enemy's formations and they drove them off. Despite going through the difficulty of having to disembark among the waves, Romans were initially successful in forcing the Britons to retreat. They set up camps. They had survived, but it would take much more than their current state to say that they had thrived. A nearly botched landing, bad weather, and the unnerving thought of being on the edge of the known world were some of the factors testing the invincible image of the Roman legions. Their ignorance of how harsh the tides in the north could be inflicted upon them great pain. They even had to dismantle some of their ships to repair the damaged ones. Seeing how Romans were struggling to adjust, encouraged some Britons to seek victory and spoils on the battlefield. Despite their bravery and courage, they failed to find the victory they had been seeking. and were eventually unable to break the armored will and battle-hardened determination of Caesar's soldiers. The Romans, though only mildly and with losses, were victorious and forced Britons into submission. It is said that Caesar did not see himself satisfyingly victorious and did not impose extreme terms on the defeated. Actually, he was not in a position to impose heavy terms. It was clear that he had to leave. Despite the determination of his legions, it was not possible for him to stay here with limited supplies and unpredictable weather, which made receiving support much harder. Caesar had not emerged as victorious as he may have first anticipated. Yet, he definitely did not return home empty-handed. He had understood what kind of modifications his fleet would need to overcome the disadvantages of having to disembark his legions on coasts of a northern island. He was going to be better prepared for the second round. The second perk of Caesar's northern adventure was the manner in which he was greeted in Italy. He was greeted as the victor of a fierce fight against the northern barbarians, some of which he had brought to Rome as slaves. Despite not being a smooth victory, Caesar's initial Britain campaign most definitely yielded many advantages, and Britain proved itself to be a worthy target for Caesar, who wished to conquer more to fuel his popularity and power in Rome. It was clear there had to be a second round, this time with a more decisive outcome for his legions. Having made his preparations, Caesar embarked upon his journey once again, backed by his battle-hardened and loyal legionaries. This invasion force was much bigger than the first one, and some later sources claimed that the reason the Britons allowed the Romans to land this time was that they were intimidated by the sheer size of their forces. It is more likely that they were just evaluating the situation, making decisions about whether or not to pull Caesar's army inland and tire his men out with hit-and-run tactics. This time, Britons had united under a leader called Cassivellaunus, who is assumed to be the leader of Catuvelloni. The warriors of Catuvelloni were some of the fiercest fighters among the Britannic tribes, and the witty manner in which they utilized chariots to maintain hit-and-run tactics were noticed by Caesar himself. The Roman legions marched inland. They met some resistance, but they drove off the attacks and forced Cassivellaunus into thinking that he could not emerge victorious from a face-to-face battle. He utilized his chariots to slow down the Roman advance with hit-and-run tactics. Unable to stop Caesar's legions, he retreated near Thames and tried to bolster his defenses, using stakes as fortifications. Some later sources claim that Caesar had brought a war elephant and used it to break the enemy, forcing them to flee and abandon their defensive positions. Good for the Romans, they were not the only enemies of Cassivellaunus. There were other tribes which had a hostile attitude towards his tribe, and the opposition of other leaders of his own tribe was clearly not helping him. Caesar, having secured pacts with some of Cassivellaunus's enemies, forced pro-resistance Britons into submission. He took some of them hostage. Yet, he could not advance any further and establish a foothold, as winter was coming and there was a revolt down south in Gaul. Dreams of a Roman Britain had to wait to be realized, and this was not to happen in Caesar's lifetime.